I'm going to leave you with this message from Guts himself. Even if we painstakingly piece together something lost, I guess it doesn't mean it will be back to normal. Those are the words that I ended my Brilliance of Casca's Dreamscape video on, and here we are, almost 8 months later since I uploaded that analysis. Berserk chapter 355 and now the newly released 359 have given more of an insight into Casca's restorative state since Shirake and Farnese dived into her dreamscape to restore her sanity, and in today's video I want to discuss these two chapters as a pair. The biggest question on Berserk's fans' minds when Casca opened her eyes at the end of chapter 354 was, what's next? What shocked me is the switch back to her pre-Eclipse self. It felt odd in context of what happened in the dreamscape. Farnese and Shirake restored Casca, but with a thorned heart, which means that the horrors of the Eclipse still linger deep within. Chapter 355, Beneath the Sundapple Trees, begins to answer these questions. The first point of interest in this chapter for me was how Casca refers to Elaine sleeping within her, the name that Luca gave her in the Albion refugee camps in the Conviction arc. This is surely referring to the sprite that Farnese interacted with within Casca's dreamscape. I don't really like theory crafting on here, but I think it's incredibly likely that this sprite will be Casca's own psyche manifestation, just like what the Beast of Darkness is to Guts. I'll talk more about this idea in chapter 359, so yeah, more on that later. I did like how Miura held off on showing Casca's eyes, aside from the waking up moment in the beginning of the page. Look at this panel of her greeting Farnese and Shirake as Casca. Her eyes are full of authority and an almost piercing gaze. It's an incredible visual indicator that this is indeed the Casca we knew in the Golden Age, compared to the vacant stare of Elaine. Miura is hammering down that Casca and Elaine are two separate personalities. Shirake takes note of this when the colour and strength of her odd was different than before. This is going to be important going forward, and as noted before, I think the sprite will take on this Elaine persona, and this is definitely not the last we've seen of the sprite. Mark my words. What's also interesting is the dream imagery continues into Casca's perception of how she saw her companions whilst as Elaine. She comments to Shirake and Farnese that seeing them as Casca is like a dream come to life, once again separating the Elaine persona from herself. Elaine was the result of Casca's horrific trauma at the Eclipse. Although she may be sane now, she has essentially locked this Elaine side of herself away, instead of coming to terms with the pain of the Eclipse. Casca then goes on to explain she remembers setting off to free Griffith from the Tower of Rebirth, but after that, No dies, and explains it's like she is still half asleep. It's interesting that this is the extent of Casca's memories, as quite a bit happens before the Eclipse, which was the breaking point of her psyche. For example, the encounters with the Bakiraka and Wild are the main two which comes to mind. I'm honestly not quite sure what to make of this, but I do have some ideas. From the brief moments we've seen of Casca so far, she does seem to be emulating herself in the Golden Age when the Band of the Hawk was at its peak. Although she led the Hawks for a year after Griffith's capture, she and the others still had a false hope that when they rescued Griffith, things somehow could have went back to the way they were, but they didn't. Griffith was a husk of himself, which will be extremely important for one of the final pages of this chapter, and this conflicts for what Casca was living for up to this point, and perhaps emulating herself before this reality hit is a way of dealing with the grief of what happened thereafter, and most importantly, the Eclipse. Farnese and Shirake look at each other and think of a heart covered in thorns. They couldn't get rid of the trauma, but instead put the thorny heart inside the Casca doll to free her from her insanity. Although the heart is intact, the thorns still remain, coiling themselves around Casca's heart. Remember what Shirake says in chapter 354, living through something so terrifying whilst preserving those memories alongside herself must have brought Casca unimaginable pain. She seems okay at this very moment because Casca's heart represents her current sense of self, but the pair know that these thorns will manifest the horrors of the Eclipse, and that this selective memory loss may be a part of this. The highlight of this whole chapter is when Farnese asks Casca if she remembers Guts. We then get a beautiful full-page spread of a cute angel who must be protected. Seriously though, I'm glad so much detail was put into this page. The blushing of Casca's face, the tears welling up in her eyes. It's a perfect visual indicator of how much Guts still means to her. I really like how Miura showed Farnese and Shirokei's reaction to this too, full of bewilderment and are almost taken in of Casca's reaction for themselves. They witness Guts and Casca's relationship through Casca's dreamscape, so it's natural they'd be taken in by Casca's emotions themselves in the physical world. Danan's dress she bestows upon Casca is a nice touch along with the new braided hair, although short hair is justice. It makes sense that Danan would have a romanticized view of a lover's reunion in her head, hence dressing up Casca in the princess garb almost. As we find out in chapter 359, this dress is only used for this chapter, so I find it very odd that Miura put this much detail in the throwaway Casca design. That being said, she looks very pretty. These next 2 pages are crucial because they are 2 sides of the same coin. The first page are the memories of Casca, and is consistent with Casca's memories only being up to the Tower of Rebirth. I don't think the size of the memory bubbles are meant to be any sort of visual indicator here, but it is worth noting that Guts appears the most in this page spread. The images used for the bubbles aren't just random Golden Age snippets, but are events which helped define Casca, including Griffith saving her life and Casca in turn dedicating her entire life to him, her conversation with Guts at the Bonfire of Dreams, and Griffith and Guts' duel are such moments in this page spread. Casca even internalizes this to herself, thinking, "Those days, painfully dear to me, proof that I am Casca." The next page shows Elaine's memories, and once again Casca is separating these personalities from herself. Memories of Farnese, Shirokei, Isidro, Puck, Guts, and all the others she's encountered post-Eclipse ring through her mind. But most importantly, look at the bottom left. The Moonlight Boy has his own dedicated memory bubble. It's interesting that the demon child did not appear in these visions, especially since he was present and the final key in Casca's dreamscape. It's also interesting that Griffith does not appear in the Elaine thought bubbles at all, even though they met at the Hill of Swords. But even then, Elaine only felt a connection to Griffith at this time because him and her child shared the same body. The Moonlight Boy is going to be a key player for Casca going forward, especially one since that he's her son, and even now from the revelation that both he and Griffith share the same body from chapter 358. I like how Casca describes her time as Elaine as only looking up at the surface from the ocean floor, as if stuck in a permanent dream. As she noted earlier in the chapter, this provides some interesting dynamics with the group going forward. She has only known them as Elaine. We've already seen this a bit with Farnese and Shirokei, but she will essentially be meeting these people for the first time as Casca, and this brings exciting possibilities of how the group dynamics are going to change, especially with Farnese, and Guts in a way, but she already knew Guts as Casca. Casca notes that a faint voice echoed, "I want to see him." Farnese and Shirokei, and even Casca herself, interprets this as Guts, but we know that this may not be the case. After all, as learned in chapter 354, the final fragment isn't Guts, but her child. Even Shirokei comments that she does not know why the fragment has taken this form, but we, the reader, does. The "someone I want to see" that the sprite talked of wasn't Guts. Whilst Guts is an incredibly important person in Casca's life, he is not what she needs to heal. It is her son which will provide this crucial step. So although on the next page we have this beautiful fairy tale-esque double page spread of Casca thinking to herself, "I want to see him," this can only end in sadness, for as Casca approaches Guts, her PTSD kicks in. Her eyes widen with memories of the eclipse surrounding Guts, and the next trigger is a broken and tortured Griffith. The tortured Griffith page is one of the best Miura pieces I've seen in a long time. Keep in mind that I think all of his work is fantastic, but just wow. The amount of detail adds to the shock and horror of seeing this from Casca's perspective. She's remembering the man she once dedicated herself to, as a husk of himself, with the exposed bone and muscle, only highlighting this. And as Casca lets out a scream, we realise that the fairy tale reunion that was pictured in the double page spread not a few pages before is just not possible in a world like Berserk. The trauma that Casca experienced didn't just go away, it's a hex around her heart, and something which will persist. Miura decides to take this in a direction that was not quite expected. We knew that Casca wouldn't be the same once restored, but guts as a trigger is just a very sad concept, and something which is explored right into chapter 359 titled Barrier, and in an interesting move, it isn't set immediately after 355, but sometime after it. The chapter starts with Danan styling Casca, complete with some new fatigues and a new weapon, but most importantly, a haircut because short hair is justice. I like her reaction to the group's shock and awe of essentially this new person they're meeting for the first time, since they only really knew the Elaine persona, with Casca responding, "Don't stare, you're making it awkward." I really like Casca's attitude here. It reminds me of a celebration scene in the Golden Age, with Casca wearing a dress and complaining about it. It's nice seeing Casca retain her old behaviour here. It's like welcoming an old friend after many years, even though we know the chapter is not going to end like this. It's also great how Isidro got his dues here. A lot of Berserk fans like to complain about Isidro, but don't forget of how crucial he was in Conviction. He comments about how much he saved Casca during the course of that arc. The dude literally did a bungee jump to grab Casca off a flaming stake. That takes guts, no pun intended. I don't even need to cite the volume since, Puck did that for me? It's also a nice touch that Casca referred to Luca and her gang, who was also referenced in the Elaine bubble memories in chapter 355. It's nice that Casca is making sense and reality almost of her dreamlike experiences as Elaine, and applying this to the person she was before the Eclipse. This carries over into perhaps one of my favourite pages in the whole chapter, Casca thanking Farnese for all she's done. Not only does Farnese apologise for her behaviour during Conviction, supporting that Farnese has developed into an entirely different person since then. Check out my relatability of Farnese video for more on that. But just look how super sweet this whole scene is. Casca grips Farnese's hands and thanks her for all she has done. I think it's really touching how formal Casca is in her gratitude. "To you I owe special thanks, my lady," which shows that Casca sees her as an authority figure, perhaps picking up on this from her days as Elaine, but more so as a motherly figure, which Casca notes in the next panel saying, "When I could cling to you, I was always at ease, like how a child feels about their mother, or a big sister." Farnese tearing up after Casca's thanks was, ironically enough, a real tearjerker for me. Farnese is one of my favourite characters in this series right now, and to see her get her rightful dues after this many years is vindicating. She's done a lot for the group and Casca in particular, and to get a proper thanks from the one she swore to protect, it's just lovely. It may seem like a throwaway line, but I do like how Serpico comments about Farnese that she's not used to being praised. Farnese's backstory after all involved her father seeing her as nothing more than an ornamentation for the Holy Iron Chain Knights, and all her life she was seen as nothing more as a burden, and only used to further her family's agenda and status when it was convenient for them. But here she is, a complete new person and choosing her own way of living, and to be genuinely appreciated for her efforts after all she's done, it's just real nice. Casca also gives a brief thanks to Shirke, whilst keeping these formalities, addressing her as Mistress Shirke, noting how the young witch dragged them out of many crises. It's interesting that even though Elaine's days felt like a dream to Casca, how clearly she can remember the events, which is good for the story in general, as the group doesn't have to catch Casca up with concepts such as magic and astral creatures, as she remembers all of this pretty clearly it seems. This is going to be really interesting once she has further conversations with Guts in the future. How is Casca going to feel about the Berserker armor? But most importantly, if she remembers events such as Shirke assisting in battle, and Farnese's care of her, then it may only be a matter of time before Guts, in a moment of weakness, forcing himself on Casca, will come into play as she remembers it. Casca ponders of how good her fighting skills are, because she has been out of commission for well over 2 years now in universe. Danan brings out some sparring partners which are called, Vikings. This is a good time as any to tell everyone to watch Vinland Saga, who were magicked into golems long ago when they came to the island. The next couple of pages are just a sparring match between Casca and these golems. Not much to say here other than they are beautifully compositioned and complement Casca's fighting style from the Golden Age. A lot of quick movements and precise actions here. The only missing detail I'd have liked to seen is her acrobatic prowess at play, like when she leaped over Adon in the Golden Age. Isidro, excited upon seeing Casca's fighting skill in action, asks for a sparring match, into which he agrees. Farnese and Shirke decide to study and encounter Guts standing behind a tree. It's a really sad sight, but it's a testament for how much Guts has developed throughout the series. Even in the Golden Age, he was still pretty headstrong and wouldn't be nearly as patient and understanding as he is now. The scene in Volume 5 comes to mind, where Guts is insistent to visiting Griffith after their battle with Zod, whilst Griffith was in an audience with some nobles. Sure, they are complete different situations, but it's a similar sort of mantra where back then, Guts didn't really care about any of that. He was stubborn, and if he wanted to see Griffith, he was going to, no matter what. But look at Guts here. He simply says, "This is fine for now. She's getting along with the rest of you. That's enough, for now." It's a level of understanding, but also in a tragic way, melancholy feeling. Guts just feels sadness at this situation, rather than rage, and doesn't disguise his feelings with being headstrong, like he used to in the Golden Age. Danan offers some words to Farnese and Shirke after this, saying, this is her predicament alone. Will she face it, or wait for time and fated bonds to heal her? And that thanks to the pair, Casca can now decide this for herself. Casca has something which Guts didn't have back then, and these are the fated bonds that Danan referred to. Even if she has to face what happened in the Eclipse alone, she has the bonds she made as Elaine to help and support her through the anguish. You may remember me saying right at the beginning of the video about how I had an idea that Casca's sprite may be setting up to be her own Beast of Darkness, but in a complete different direction. This page is why I started to gear towards that idea. Farnese gets Casca's attention and points at Guts standing behind the tree. Whilst this is happening, Farnese has an internal monologue that, when you were scared, it was I who pressed your heart into you. You can see him. With those words, we parted. Farnese interpreted Casca's sprite as meaning Guts when she says, I want to see him. But remember, the final fragment, it was her child. I can see a scenario in the future where Farnese will need to project her astral body within Casca, much like Shirke does with Guts, whilst he's in the Berserker armor. Then again, I'm not 100% on that, as Shirke only astral projects within Guts whilst he's possessed by the Berserker armor, perhaps due to it being a magical armor itself. It may not be possible for Farnese to do this with Casca, who wields no such magical properties, but I think it's an interesting idea to explore nonetheless. This may allow Farnese to talk with the Casca sprite again, and give a different paralogue to Guts and Shirke's relationship. Whilst the purpose of their one is for Shirke to tame the hatred within Guts, Casca's would manifest more as a scared child, and Farnese could console and reinterpret her words of, I want to see him, perhaps when the Moonlight Boy shows up? And here it is, what we've been waiting for. Casca and Guts' first proper interaction post-Eclipse. May I just say I love how this is framed. It reminds me of a Bonfire of Dreams, but this time, the roles are reversed, with Guts standing against the tree, and Casca just standing slightly away. Casca notes to Guts that he has good friends, and that she knows them too. But this is when she was Elaine, who she is still distinguishing as its own separate persona. It's really saddening of how silent Guts is during this whole exchange. The reader can gauge from the end of chapter 355 why this has to be the case. Guts himself is a trigger for Casca's memories of the Eclipse after all. hence why he is obscuring himself behind the tree in the first place. Casca mentions of how Isidro is very attached to Guts, and comments of how unthinkable it would have been that Guts would have taken a student in his old days. This is another factor of why I like Casca applying her Elaine memories to her newly restored mindset. She can see how Guts has grown as a person compared to how she knew him in the Golden Age. It's a small detail, but I found this kind of cute. When Casca says how Isidro has Guts' headstrong streak, but says, though his teacher was even more stubborn, Guts has an embarrassed sweat drop going down his face. I'm glad at least some semblance of his relationship is retained, even if it's only in small bursts like this. It reminds me of when Casca teased Guts for worrying about her when they went off to save Griffith from the Tower of Rebirth in the Golden Age. But as with Berserk, this levity doesn't last for long, as when Casca points out that Isidro's two-blade fighting style is similar to Judo's. This causes a trigger for her. It starts with her remembering Judo's last moments as she was carrying him to the face of the Apostle which killed him in the Eclipse, and then this haunting page of Casca remembering these horrors, through Judo shielding Casca from the Apostle, him succumbing to his wounds to his death, the God Hand, they're all on display here. These next two pages are devastating. Casca falls to the ground in agony due to these horrible memories manifesting, and as Guts notices this and goes to help her, she instead sees Guts surrounded by the Apostles involved in the Eclipse, extremely similar to the double-page spread near the end of chapter 355. Guts' reaction is heart-wrenching, as the woman he loves is screaming in anguish just by looking at him. Look at his face here, it's one of complete sadness and heartache, gone out of the twisted reactions of rage and hatred from the Black Swordsman, but instead, it's just complete and utter despair. The journey he went on to protect the woman he loves, she can't even see him without being reminded of the horrors of what happened on that fated day, the Eclipse. And here Skull Knight's words ring deep in the ears of every Berserk reader. There's no guarantee your wish will be her wish. One really heartfelt but also sad touch is how Farnese is the one who consoles Casca after these horrific episodes, embracing her as Guts walks away. I'm glad that Farnese and Casca's relationship is retaining this tone, and I'm interested to see how this dynamic is going to work in the future, with Farnese consoling PTSD compared to being Casca's caretaker while she was Elaine. The chapter ends with Skull Knight, who last showed up in the manga, not counting flashbacks of course, in 2009. Oh my god, it's been 10 years since our Calcium boy has shown up. I do want to note before I move on to Skull Knight that Berserk fans have noted that Guts walking away from the group in this panel is eerily similar to Guts leaving the Band of a Hawk in the Golden Age. I don't really want to speculate too much on this, but I do think it's a slight red herring. I sincerely doubt Guts will be going solo again, especially after his resolve in the Conviction arc. Skull Knight's appearance now is fascinating. He only really usually appears at temporal junction points. The Eclipse, Reincarnation Ceremony and Astral Merge are the main ones to note. There are exceptions to this rule, for example like Shirke and Guts meeting Skull Knight on the beach. But Guts usually only bumps into him when Skull Knight is already on his way for an event to do with the God Hand. He very rarely approaches Guts directly. Skull Knight's timing, with the revelations in chapter 358 that the Moonlight Boy and Griffith share the same body, is very suspect. The child will be on his way to see his parents, Guts and Casca, whilst sharing the body with one of the God Hand. Does Skull Knight know this? We will just have to find out. To sum this up, these two chapters were an extremely effective way to get Casca back into the fold of a story, whilst having lasting consequences of the Eclipse on Casca's psyche. Things just can't go back to normal. Guts knew as much, but this just seems too cruel. Casca can't look at one of the people she cares most for without being reminded of those horrors. But not all is lost. She has something that Guts didn't have, a support group who are with her every step of the way. But most importantly, what she needs to heal most of all is said by her sprite. I want to see him. Perhaps the Moonlight Boy's reappearance will provide some of the internal healing that Casca needs. But with Griffith sharing a body with her son, and this being Berserk, we are just left with a bittersweet feeling. Thanks so much for watching.